My name is Daryl Carter. I am a tenured full professor in the Department of History. I am director of the Black American Studies program, and I am associate dean for community relations and outreach for the College of Arts and Sciences. I've been here for 15 years. This is the beginning of my 16th year. I'm a political historian. I also do African American history. I'm especially interested on the intersections of race and power and politics and class and things of that nature. And so today, I am honored to be able to speak here to talk a little bit about things that I see in regard to higher education and what the current state of it is and things of that nature. Naturally, my discussion today will be around issues surrounding access and DEI. But there are other things that are also part of trends that are taking place that are not going to be discussed today. So it won't be totally, this is everything that's happening, but it will be strongly directed towards the political as well as DEI and my analysis of those issues. And so when I think about higher education and I think about the current state in 2023, there are a number of things that I'd like to go over. Number one, I think of upheaval. I think of a sector of America that is undergoing transformation in key ways in terms of how we view students, the relationship regarding shared governance, the faculty, the issues regarding public and private education. I think about issues regarding this notion of private benefit versus public good. I think about an increasingly consumeristic type of mindset as regards students across the nation and institutions of higher education. So that's one. I think of that upheaval in that kind of way. In short, that increasingly people are seeing higher education as a private benefit as opposed to a public good. Two, upheaval in terms of how we view higher education as a credible institution in this country. Increasingly, Americans across the nation are viewing higher ed with suspicion, seeing higher ed as not necessarily thorough in terms of its, or I shouldn't say thorough, but in terms of not seeing higher ed as absolutely necessary, seeing higher ed as increasingly political and partisan, of seeing higher ed as suspect, of seeing higher ed as something that is elitist, something that is increasingly gender oriented, as in the minds of many people, it's increasingly thought of in terms of women as opposed to men. Well, along with arguments about masculinity that we see taking place in the country today. So that's a part of this as well. I think that we are witnessing some much needed challenging of traditional orthodoxy regarding higher ed insofar as it relates to asking key questions about what are we doing, why are we doing it, who is benefiting from it, and how are we going to help students achieve their dreams. Some of it is not so good. Some of it is simply attacks on higher ed that are designed or are framed in the language of reform, that we're going to reform higher ed, that we're going to take it back and put it in its proper place. So I see that kind of upheaval there as well. I think the gender aspect of higher ed, as we can see on this campus, where we now have roughly, based on 22 numbers, roughly 63.5% female student body, is both a thing to celebrate in terms of trying to reach gender parity, but it also raises real questions in my mind about what is happening with male students, not just at our institution, but a lot of other institutions across the country. And so what does it mean when you have 18 and 25-year-old men and young boys who have no college education, who do not have any meaningful prospects, and have a lot of time on their hands. What does that mean? How does that impact society? So I'm thinking about not just the institution and the loss of those students and enrollment, but in terms of what does that do to our politics? What does that do to our culture? What does that do to our society? Um, so that's a bit of upheaval that I'm also concerned with and thinking about. I think that, on this issue of, upheaval, we can see this in the ways that the universities are funded that is in many respects different than what it was 30 or 40 years ago. Some of that has been good, putting the focus on student success. Some of that has contributed to the student death crisis in the country. And the racial dynamics of that are very clear. We can see that in the response to President Biden's efforts to eliminate student loan debt for various groups across the country, and the pushback towards that, as students of color, for example, poor students and others are more likely to carry student debt than, say, students who are white, who are middle and upper class, who may not have as much debt or have any debt at all. And so we do need to consider some of that as we're thinking about issues of equity and success and access and making students' dreams come true. It's hard to make those dreams come true when students are saddled with 40, 50, 60, or even much more debt just from student loans. My own student loans were just paid off in the last couple years. So I know a little bit about what that's like to have student loans in the house. Both my wife and I both had those. So that's another aspect of this. The affordability of higher education. The other issues that I want to get into regarding the current state are some of the issues regarding partisan attacks on the institution and what certain states are doing to go after their universities for what they see as failures to educate or what they see are opportunities to take back institutions of higher education and reorient them towards what they consider to be the proper disposition for higher ed. We see this at New College down in Sarasota in Florida, in which there's been massive upheaval there. Florida's been talking about this. There's been talk in various circles in Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and other places around the country about what should these institutions look like? Where does academic freedom play a role? And so with that in mind, I would like to give, just for a few minutes here, a little background on how we got to this place and in terms of my view and analysis. When we look back to the 50s and 60s, we think about a lot of things. We think about the Cold War, we think about Vietnam, we think about the assassinations of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King and others. We think about environmentalism and the war on poverty and the Great Society. But one of the things that we're working on is, in terms of historians, is the influence of that era on the present. And by that I mean talking about issues about how civil rights, for example, are influencing and the success of the civil rights movement are influencing things presently. How issues of the John Birch Society and political extremism are impacting us today. And so to that end, let's get into it. When we think about civil rights as it became known in the 60s was a very limited form of civil rights insofar as the original, when it's juxtaposed with the original thought of human rights. And so it was legalistic. It was give me the right to vote. It was I should be able to go to the school that I want to go to the university that I want to, go to the professional school or the graduate school that I want to. I should be able to live in a neighborhood that I can afford to live in, so on and so forth. And I should be able to get a job without discrimination in employment. And that was important. They were landmark achievements that allow for the Supreme Court, for example, to say that segregated education was unconstitutional. It was a landmark to have the 57 Civil Rights Act, although watered down. It proved that the Senate could finally break through the obstructionism of the Southern Democrats in order to pass the Civil Rights Bill. The 64 Civil Rights Bill was tremendous in terms of its impact on the country. And the 65 Voting Rights Act, which allowed, for example, the Justice Department to go into the South and other areas that had long histories of racial segregation and abuse, to make sure that Black people, for example, were able to vote. Beyond that, we saw higher ed and K through 12 open up in ways that it hadn't previously, in part because of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, and by the 70s, things like Pell Grants, and of course, student loans, Stafford and unsubsidized Stafford loans. Also, a greater focus on hiring of faculty that takes place, for example, throughout the 1960s at universities across the country, so on and so forth. The Fair Housing Bill in 1968 as well, that takes aim at segregation in housing. So when I look at that, today it sounds almost rather quaint, right? That of course this is constitutional, of course that was unconstitutional, of course this abuse of power should not happen. But the blowback from that and the backlash to those successes has never really stopped. And what I mean by that is that it was consumed into other political paradigms throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the way into the 21st century. And this includes this belief that the courts are acting in a nakedly political and partisan manner, and that they're judicial activists, right? And that therefore there needs to be a correction. We can see this with the creation of the Federalist Society in the 70s. And they've been pursuing a legal direction that hopefully that they could push back that to what they consider the proper jurisprudence for the nation, which is usually before 1939 when Roosevelt starts changing the court. And it's why they spend so much time focusing on the court, which is ruled time and time again between the beginning of the 40s and the early 2000s on issues of race and class and gender and things like that, that many in the Federalist Society and others felt was improper. So that's one aspect there. Losing what some activists and DEI circles have called privilege has been also another blowback, right? In which creating a fair employment and an educational workplace has been annoying. And I'm being just flat out straight about it, has been annoying to certain groups that did not believe that those individuals, Black, brown, and other, were equal to them. Also, they did not like the fact that you're competing over finite resources, and that now they were having to compete against people that they did not believe to be equal to them. There were simple economic concerns outside of race of, if this happens, then what does this mean to my husband, my son, my brother, my cousin, so on and so forth. So those issues are playing a role there. But there's a dynamic there that takes place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s where you can still see some politicians who are nakedly racist in their behavior, but they're increasingly intolerant, and the public's increasingly intolerant of just these open displays of bigotry, right? And so you hear a new language being used, right, around reform or issues of fairness. You see issues regarding well, we need to talk about the taxpayers. We need to talk about crime. We need to talk about immigration. We need to talk about this and that and women and, little babies and whether or not they're being aborted. And so there's all these kinds of cultural and social issues there that are taking on a new kind of non-racial or non-racially specific language that absolutely has a racially specific or culturally specific inflection. And so by the early 1980s, the Reagan administration, and it comes into being in 81, in part on this animus towards much of that racial and social and cultural change that took place in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And Reagan represents that in many ways. Not saying that Reagan in any way, shape, or form is a bigot, although he's been recorded saying some very racist things. But it's simply to say that the movement that in part he represents is more complicated and more nuanced than simply government needs to get out of the way, taxes are bad, so on and so forth. And many of the people to come into the Reagan administration are hard right, doctrinaire type of individuals who have very specific views on a host of issues, whether it's, Justice Bork, Judge Bork, or it's future Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, future Supreme Court Justice himself, or somebody else. I'm thinking Samuel Alito as well. So there are issues there around that, and so you develop a language that is not racially specific, in order to have, as Lee Atwater, who was an aide to Bush and to Reagan, talked about, has absolutely racialized impact when you talk about crime and things of that nature. And by the 80s, they're also talking about this crisis in higher ed and K through 12 and how things need to be reformed. As early as the late 80s, you start hearing this talk about what is happening to young boys and men in education. We can see this type of talk come out in government reports about the crisis in education and what needs to be done about it in order to be competitive and all these other things. But one of the key things that had changed between the late 50s and the mid 1980s was that higher ed had become more diverse than what it was before, and that the integration of the universities across the country over the period of the previous 30 years had created anger, resentment, things of that nature in many corners of the country. Especially as the nature of the curriculum started to change and you started to see the creation of women's studies programs, Africana or Black studies programs across the country, the demands of Black students and Latinx students and others to have diverse offerings in terms of the courses that are taught, the material that is used, the faculty that are used to instruct those courses, so on and so forth. That really does not go away. And then, of course, the gendered aspect of, okay, there's a lot more women present in these universities than were present just a generation before. The diversification of the country and along ethnic and racial lines since the late 60s and since the Congress overturned the racist immigration laws of the mid 1920s, you see not only this diversification taking place along the domestic lines of, okay, we have Blacks, whites, et cetera, or indigenous people, but we also see an increasing number of people who are coming from Latin America directly, who are coming from Africa, who are coming from Asia, that are also diversifying education circles in ways that had not existed, say, at the end of World War II. That only accelerates by the end of the century. And as early as 1992, Patrick Buchanan, who was a journalist who became a speechwriter and a key political aide to Richard Nixon, bemoaned the diversity that was taking place. And when he ran for president in 1992, he talked in starkly populist terms, often with anti-Semitic and racialized undertones, about the diversity that he felt and a lot of other Americans that supported his candidacy felt was destroying the country. So that plays a role in this as well. By the 2000s, things are going to change in key ways that are going to both compress, I think, the country, that is going to accelerate some of these divisions and some of these other issues, and are also going to allow for groups that are far left of or right of center to take a central role, if you will, in American politics and higher ed, for example. And so one of those things is what we just remembered yesterday, which is the issue of 9/11. The shadows of 9/11 continue to reverberate. They continue to hang over the country 22 years later. We see this in a variety of ways. We see this in terms of finally making that break with that Cold War mentality and what that meant. And that includes that Cold War mentality that had this strong support for higher education, right? That we can trace back all the way to the end of World War II, and then of course under President Eisenhower and President Johnson. The second thing is it raises real questions about security concerns, about privacy concerns, about chaos in the country, about East and West and the conflict, as one political science talked about, in the 90s, in regard to this, the next conflict being between the cultures in the East and the West. We watched this just in the last 2 years in Afghanistan, as that country was overrun by the Taliban, and they swiftly moved all women out of government positions, out of education, so on and so forth. So that's a part of that. The growing economic inequality has also influenced this at a time where increasingly by 2001, 2, 3, 4, students were becoming dependent on student loans in a way that they weren't, say, at the beginning of the 1980s. And that had an influence on how people felt about higher ed, and also raised real questions about the value in some people's mind about higher education. If the costs are going up, but the benefits are seemingly going down, and people are not are increasingly not economically, financially, materially, and the same shape that their parents were when they went through college in the 1970s, then you can see some of the roots of that kind of discontentment that is starting to sprout up there across a variety of lines. So what good is a college education? Some people argued, and still are arguing, if it is not making that kind of tremendous difference. It's more complex than that. We know that college education is a net win for our individuals who go to school and finish and develop credentials and diplomas and degrees and all that kind of stuff. But for a lot of people, that was not happening as the world began to change from an industrialized society into an information tech, high tech, finance based society. And that's the other aspect of this I want to discuss for a moment. By 1969, most historians trace the beginning of the decline of industrial America. Not in the sense that industrial America is going away in any sense. We still have a lot of manufacturing in this country, particularly advanced manufacturing. But in the sense that the old style of labor, which was dependent upon brawn, it was dependent upon muscle, was going away, particularly as the third world and keyways started to catch up with the West, particularly the United States, and their ability, for example, to do economic things, to engage in trade, so such and such. And then American businessmen, for example, figured out that it was cheaper to export jobs, to engage in trade. Most economists will tell you that trade is good. Trade is good for you because it's cheaper and more efficient to trade products as opposed to engage in protectionist fiscal and economic policy. But what happens when John Q. Citizen in Nashville, Tennessee, or in Kingsport, or in Atlanta, or in the South Side of Chicago loses that job that paid for their home, that paid for their kids to go to school, and now they're doing service-related jobs which pay far less with far less benefits, and just a harder life overall. And so there are some real concerns about that. I think higher education for a long time did not do well in terms of explaining itself, its importance, its relevance, and why people should go to school, and what they could get out of it. I think the universities across the country were somewhat arrogant in that regard. I think the pleasant things over the last 10, 15 years is that there's been that recognition that we can do things better, particularly from a student success and access viewpoint. And so we have begun, and ETSU is a testament to this, of increasingly using best practices and data and research to inform how we're engaging with students, how we're recruiting them, how we're trying to keep them here, how we're advising them, and of course, how we're teaching them. And so I'm very proud of that, and very proud to be a part of an institution that is committed to its students in that way. But the point still remains that we are still struggling with some of those issues. We're not alone in that. We're part of that larger ecosystem, and of course, we're working hard on that space every day. But we still have a ways to go. That being said, I also think about these issues, those changing demographics of who's going to school is important, particularly the issue of increasingly men not going. The war plays a role in some of that. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also by 2008, you have a truly momentous event, and that is the election of the nation's first Black president. And the reason why that is so important is important for historical reasons, but it's important as well in understanding the increasing instability that we see in American political life, right? When you hear journalists talk about issues of the debt ceiling and why the debt ceiling used to be almost sacrosanct, you didn't mess around with it. That was largely true. I mean, they would have brutal fights from time to time, but it becomes a weapon here. It becomes a zero-sum game as one political party is determined just basically by the tyranny of the minority to obstruct anything and everything that they did not come up with. Also blaming higher ed for contributing to a problem that really it did not contribute to, at least not in that way. Universities are also in certain ways, in terms of their prestige and the high regard that people used to hold them in, has declined as we have watched social media become such an integral part of the American experience, whether it's Facebook or TikTok or it's Twitter or X now, excuse me, or it's Threads or it's Instagram or it's something else. It's hard to have for a lot of Americans intellectual humility when they could be their own expert on Facebook. When they can find people that are going to help them engage in confirmation bias, right? It's not just watching this particular network, it's also watching privately on your own devices people that agree with you. And that's hard for a university to compete with because naturally, as human beings, we want people to agree with us. We can talk till the cows come home about we don't want people to, blow sunshine up our skirts. But the fact of the matter is, people like it when people agree with you. I can tell you when my kids disagree with me or my wife disagrees with me, or I have a colleague here at work who would disagree with me. It gets under your skin a little bit. You're like, you should see the worth of my idea here or how great this is, right? But universities are engaged in scientific and academic inquiry, and that lends itself to both evidence and data and information and things that are verifiable. And those kinds of things are often at odds with social media. And so when I think about that state, the current state of higher education today, I think it's hard to compete with that. I know I've had students who said, well, I've seen this on Facebook, or my friend sent me this, and I have to take a quick look at it and tell them that's wrong, and here's the reason why it's wrong. Here are the actual facts or evidence behind this, and this is what they're doing. So that's hard as well. It's hard when religious figures are indoctrinating potential students and telling them essentially either don't go to university or don't believe what they're telling you. When university as an experience should be a place of tremendous personal and emotional and professional growth that is going to hopefully set you up for the rest of your life. So that's important as well. And I think that social media thing is taken on a life of its own over the last 16 years, which we really have not come to grips with. We just have not come to grips with, and it's impacting everything that we're doing. 10 years ago, if somebody said put, courses on Facebook in terms of the advertisement for the course coming up the next semester, I would have said that's kind of crazy. Why would you do that? We've got a bulletin board right down the hall. But today, everybody uses the social media to advertise classes, to talk about what's happening at the university. Every time President Nolan has a major event or has a major talk with the media, as he did when he informed the community of the really good news that came out of the enrollment stuff at the beginning of the semester. That was also put on social media, and that was great. And I really enjoyed that. But often what we see is not mature voices like Dr. Nolan taking up the public square. We see somebody who lacks expertise, lacks knowledge, and is often driving an agenda that's based on division, an agenda that's based on separating people from one another and also dehumanizing people. And so when we talk about that current state of higher ed, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to work harder to humanize one another, to develop cultural humility, to recognize you just might be wrong. You just might be wrong. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to learn. I was just talking to a faculty member this morning, right before this, about a student that we're trying to build up. We're trying to build up her confidence, build up her resiliency, things of that nature. But the student is kind of fragile in that way, which is a little bit different than what we typically would have seen 10 years ago or 15 years ago in terms of that resiliency part. But the student, just is struggling a little bit with people telling her that things could be done better. This person's, kind of fixed in her position. She's not alone. We have, faculty to do that too from time to time. We're all guilty of that. But the university's core mission about education and leadership and community and others and developing a professional persona is also having to go up against some pretty major societal forces that are in direct opposition to that. And of course, we see that in our political life when we see universities weaponized, when we see higher ed weaponized, and when we see diversity programs and DEI programs, which are dedicated to making sure that often the most vulnerable people have access to higher ed, to have access to graduate schools and professional schools. When we see those types of things being weaponized, it's really, really disturbing. And so, one of the things that I noticed this summer was the Supreme Court decision in regard to the Harvard and the UNC cases. And basically what was argued there by a group of right-wing activists was that the admissions policies at Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill were unconstitutional, they argued, because race was a consideration. Race is not necessarily a problematic issue in and of itself, as far as I am concerned, but they were arguing that it was. And they were using not white students, which they had usually been using going back to the Bakke case in '78. They were using, in this case, Asian American students. And in the case of Harvard, Harvard's 20% Asian American. It's kind of hard to make the argument that your university is discriminating when 20% or a fifth of the university is that population. Doesn't mean things can't be done better, but the Supreme Court really didn't answer those kinds of questions. They were looking for a case in which they could rule on this particular matter in a broad way, and they were able to do that successfully in June. But when I think about that, there's, ETSU received notifications from various groups talking about you can't do this, can't do that after that happened in July. So along with probably 300 other universities during the month of July. And by August, 200 law firms across the nation, particularly law firms to promote equity and diversity and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, particularly in corporate America. So we're seeing an attack on that in higher ed that is really disturbing, really unhelpful, and has profound impacts not just on the groups that are there, but it's ahistorical. Race has always been a part of American law, from the one drop and 3/5 rules, right, to the idea that slavery goes through the mother, and therefore, because the mother's black, you're automatically a slave and a slave for life. To the Fugitive Slave Act before, and the years before the Civil War, to Jim Crow itself. The reason we have HBCUs all across the country, from Howard and Spelman and Morehouse and North Carolina A&T and FAMU and Fisk University and Meharry Medical College, is because the land grants, the C grants, would not allow for Black students to integrate those institutions until well into the 60s, for the most part. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, students could not apply there. So it was okay to segregate and use the law in that way. And I think this is the frustration that many people of color have, particularly in the BIPOC community, which is you can have this long historical history of using race in really negative ways, but then we argue here in terms of a Supreme Court ruling that providing access and opening access is problematic. That even teaching things, for example, in state laws in various states across the country, particularly in the southeastern United States, talking about things regarding implicit bias training is, and you can't do this in a mandatory way. It has to only be voluntary. And it's like, wait a second here. What is the real aim, right? Is the real aim to be to take away an injury that is allegedly occurring, or is the issue more nefarious than that? People of goodwill can disagree on these points, but what we do know is that the country is changing. It's not going backwards. And we know that having diversity in higher education is really important. We need students from all backgrounds. We need faculty and staff from all backgrounds. And even the Supreme Court in their ruling there said that universities could use race in the context of personal essays and personal experience to make decisions. In the case of the service academies like Harvard, West Point, Annapolis, and others, they could use race more nakedly because there was a compelling national interest for that. And so, as it regards that point there, that gives me real pause. Last week, Yale University announced a settlement with the same group that sued Harvard and UNC, in which they agreed to take off the check boxes like your racial identity and things like that, and keep that away from the admissions officers, in order to settle a suit that had been simmering since the other suit was ratcheting up. So these DEI challenges are very real. But what happens if the motive is really to take away any acknowledgement of race or ethnicity as a whole, right? By taking away those tools of acquiring information and data about who makes up the country, who makes up communities, who makes up the universities, who makes up K through 12, so on and so forth. Recognizing, I think, by their actions that very data has been used now for decades, for more than 80, 90 years in legal cases, testifying to the inequities within American society, promoted in many cases by American law. And so universities have been very good at defending, particularly rhetorically, defending themselves and saying, this is a value that we hold dear, that we can see the real benefits academically and professionally and financially, et cetera, when we have a diverse society. But if you are working in DEI spaces, or you're working at universities that are subject to entities, state entities that may be more antagonistic, it does raise some concerns. And so I was at a conference in April of this year in which people I was talking to from Florida and from Texas were in tears because their life's work of providing access often to some of the most vulnerable people who otherwise couldn't go to college was directly under attack from their admissions policies to how much money they were spending on trying to get students, BIPOC students, into the universities, to their every expenditure they made, to every school that they visited, emails that they had sent came under review by, in many cases, state legislators, so on and so forth. So that's it's troubling. It's a difficult environment. And the reason I gave you some talk, just very little, about the civil rights movement is because that plays a role here. There's a lot of people who did not like what happened, but we don't generally talk about that. We focus on the success, but what we have seen is the ability of a lot of people who have been forced by societal norms to keep quiet. That has no longer been happening over the last few years. Increasingly, they're loud, they're out there, and they're saying things in racialized ways that are increasingly taken into the mainstream. And so when I think about higher ed, I think higher ed is under attack by certain groups in the country. And I think it's well positioned as well to fight back against that by engaging in students, engaging communities and regions that they serve, by working with the high schools that they often do business with in terms of, exposing high school students to university, working with faculty and supporting local faculty and things of that nature, to AP issues and dual enrollment and all that kind of thing. I think we're in a great place to do that. I will say this shall pass. This will pass. But what will the university look like in 20, 30, 40 years? That's the question. And uh, I think we've made a lot of progress. Now we're getting some of the pushback to that, and it's incumbent upon all of us to, number one, protect the free speech rights of our faculty and staff and students, but also force one another to take principled positions based on evidence and based on a public morality that recognizes the humanity of our fellow Buccaneers. And I'm alumni as well as faculty, so the institution means something to me in a way that some of my colleagues don't because they didn't go to school here, but I did, and it means a lot to me. And I'm very proud of where the institution has gone over the period of the past 30 years, but we still have work to do. And so when I look at the state of higher education today, I see upheaval, I see conflict, I see some elements of transformation, I see other areas of great concern. But all in all, I feel like we are in a period of, if we handle it correctly, a period that is going to really set universities across the nation in a good position going forward for the next generation of Americans. I know it's 12:45 and we've only got about 10, 12 minutes left. So I wanted to kind of stop there. I've been talking a lot, and I'm sorry if I talk too much. But just to see if there are any comments or if there are any questions out there that anybody might have, I'm happy to discuss those, or at least try to. So I've got a question here. Can I talk a little bit about DEI offices being closed on campuses and organizations? Sure. I'll use ETSU first. We are not closing our offices. And if you have questions about the institutional aspects of that, please talk to Dr. Keith Johnson, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion. What ETSU has done is, in response to recently passed legislation in the Tennessee General Assembly, is that we have changed the job titles and the office titles of people like me across the university and the colleges. My title went from Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion to Associate Dean for Community Relations and Outreach. And the big reason why we did that, we did so at the request of the president and the provost, in order, after they consulted with the university council, Dr. Mark Folks, because there are some aspects of the recently passed legislation that require reporting, that have reporting requirements, and we feel, the institution feels, that is best handled by the Office of the President and the Office of Equity and Inclusion at the university level. And so we did that for that reason. We also did that because with Keith, Dr. Johnson's role, he is considered to be, that's his role, even though I know he's a faculty member. But we don't consider myself, for example, to be 100% in the office of the dean. We also know that I'm a tenured full professor. So there's that. But in universities and other places like Texas, they are banning. And Florida, they are trying to ban, or flat out are banning, DEI offices and trying to redistribute that money, things of that nature. I will say that it's an attack on higher ed that is deeply, deeply problematic. It's unfortunate. It should not be happening. but it is and is being led in many cases by state legislators and governors who are pursuing campuses. And because they fundamentally disagree with that. Some of them are pandering to their own voters and pandering to other groups or positioning themselves for higher office, as we clearly watched in Florida. So I don't want to go too much further there because of time, but I expect these efforts to continue for some time of trying to strip DEI programs out. It's a little tough because we have accreditation requirements, we have individual program accreditation expectations and requirements, and we have corporate America and the military and nonprofit world that are all looking for us to have meaningful educational experiences, including diversity and equity and inclusion, that will help them in their business. And so it gets a little tricky there. Thank you for the question. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so the next question is, what about closer to home? ETSU's handling of the dropping of men's indoor track and field by throwing up Title IX as an excuse. Seems a campus with 63% women should be prepared. Thank you for the question. So let me start off with a full disclaimer and disclosure. I had no role in that, and I know little more than what you have read in the newspapers. I will say this: I'm in full support of the of Title IX in that effort. ETSU, as my understanding, has had some issues. Most schools do, to one degree or another, in terms of fulfilling Department of Education guidelines for Title IX. It did seem sudden to me, but that's a personal opinion as opposed to an informed analysis. Like I said, I really don't know. I was not a part of that. If I had to take any qualm with what the university did there, I would simply say more context would have been better in terms of what was happening. I thought it was kind of a terse statement. But I recognize that there's probably some issues regarding Title IX once we brought football back. Some things of that nature. I was just talking to somebody recently and in the university, and the issue came up of fundraising, and the principal in charge of that office said, well, we need to make sure that we're taking care of this in regard to these other programs. And they were athletic programs. And I said, okay, because they were making a conscious effort to do that. So the overall student body thing that you reference in regard to 60%, 63% female, that is one part of it, but it's also about Title IX is also about the having a proportional impact on various parts of education. So, for example, we focus on student athletes, but it also can impact other areas. But for student athletes, it can get into issues about how many scholarships are being offered, how much money is being spent on the individual programs, the opportunities that those male athletes have compared to other students. So it gets a little tricky. I think the smart thing for me to say here, because I don't have all the facts, is that the University Counsel, Dr. Mark Folks, is really good and really receptive to questions, particularly these type of more legal questions. And as the University Counsel, he can really give you a firm analysis of why the university took the position that it did and why it made the decision in athletics that it did. So I'm sorry, I wish I could give you more, but I would be lying if I said I knew more. Thank you. Okay. Well, if there's any other questions or somebody would like to chat offline at some point, please feel free to email me at carterda@etsu.edu. I appreciate you. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a blessed and pleasant rest of your day.